Popping y'all, it's Control, Party Team 1. We're going to be talking to y'all about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm going to kick off with, in June of 1963, current President John F. Kennedy was trying to get a comprehensive civil rights bill passed. Reasoning being because of the resistance to desegregation and the murder of Medgar Evers. Kennedy faced great personal and political conflicts over this legislation. On the one hand, he was sympathetic to African American citizens whose dramatic protests highlighted the glaring gap between American ideals and American realities. President Kennedy called the white resistance to civil rights for blacks a moral crisis and pledged support to a federal action of integration. The same night, however, Medgar Evers returned home just after midnight. He left his car with a handful of Jim Crow Must Go t-shirts. He was sadly shot in the back on the front porch and died in the hospital 50 minutes later. After Kennedy was assassinated, President Lyndon Johnson pressed hard to try and get this bill passed. With the support of Roy Wilkins and Clarence Mitchell, Congress passed Public Law 88-352. The act, which also paved the way for further school desegregation and prohibition of discrimination in public places and within federal agencies. The agencies was backed by over half of America. And while the act was born out of discrimination, violence, and conflict, its legacy, 50 years later, is one of a more equal and unified America. Now, the act passed the Senate on a 73-27 vote. The Democratic supermajority split their vote, 46 and 21 against. The Republicans, on the other hand, split their vote, 27 for and 6 against. The no vote consisted of 78% Democrats. On the other hand, the House voted 290 to 130 in favor. Democrats split their vote 152 to 96, while Republicans split theirs 138 to 34.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Provisions of the Civil Rights Act forbid discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. The Act prohibited discrimination in the public accommodations federally funded programs. It also strengthened the enforcement of voting rights and the desegregation of schools. The passage into Jim Crow laws, which were laws that enforced segregation in the South. Jim Crow laws were upheld in the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the court held that racial segregation claimed to be separate but equal was constitutional. In the 50s, school districts that had been segregated since the Civil War began to win court cases for integration. School districts that were unable to win cases began to petition the Supreme Court, such as with Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that separate but equal was unconstitutional and that the segregation of public schools and other public places violated the 13th and 14th Amendment. Plessy v. Ferguson was a court case in 1896 that upheld racial segregation with separate but equal. The case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which African-American train passenger Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car for black people. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that a law that implies merely a legal distinction between white people and black people is not unconstitutional. As a result, restricted Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became commonplace. Jim Crow laws required the separation of white people and people of color on all forms of public transportation and in schools. Eventually, the separation expanded to include interaction in schools, cemeteries, parks, theaters, and restaurants. Anyone who was suspected of having a black ancestor, even just one in the very distant past, was considered to be a person of color and therefore subject to the Jim Crow laws.
In the months leading up to the bill being signed, there was support for the act, but still 1 in 3 were opposed to the bill. When the implementation phase began, support was just more than 50%, with nearly 1 in 5 voicing uncertainty about the bill. As the civil rights movement intensified and turned violent sometimes, the legacy of the act was cast into doubt. The second half of the 1960s saw the assassination of civil rights leaders such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Riots in Alabama, Los Angeles, New York, and Detroit, as well as the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which banned discrimination in the 1980s, saw new generations of Americans that believed the Civil Rights Act had indeed worked. 92% of respondents in a 1984 poll on the attitudes and opinions of Black Americans stated that the civil rights movement had indeed improved the lives of the Black community, deeply affected American society. Although these rights were first guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution immediately after the Civil War, they had never been fully enforced. It was only after years of highly publicized civil demonstration, marches, and violence that American politicians acted and enforced these rights.